Hey everyone, Dr. Brown here. Welcome to another part of our Nature Unbound series. Today we're looking at part 2 of exploring the nature of energy flow. As you recall from last week, we focused on part 1, an introduction to the nature of energy flow. Energy ultimately all comes from the sun, and we saw how it moves from the sun into our primary producers, the plants, and how they use photosynthesis to generate glucose, a usable form of energy that other organisms can use. And we saw how consumers, including both herbivores, omnivores, and carnivores, use this energy. And ultimately, we finished with the detritivores recycling that energy back into the food chain. Today, we're going to build on that a little bit of complexity. Energy does not always flow in this nice linear form that a food chain gives the impression of. In fact, usually it's quite complicated. So let's go back to our wetland ecosystem. And let's trace that flow of energy and then add it into a food web. We're going to start with a plant. This is an arrowhead plant. We actually have them around our pond at Little Creek. This would be a producer, and then of course it is consumed by a consumer. For instance, this is a pond snail. And that pond snail also is consumed by other organisms, such as this green sunfish. And if you like to eat fish, then that green sunfish could be consumed by you if you happen to catch it. Ultimately, this energy all comes from the sun. The arrowhead plant is a producer, and everything else that you see is a consumer. But there's a little more in this ecosystem than just arrowhead plants, pond snails, green sunfish, and you. There are other producers, such as cattails. And don't forget those little green algae. So algae are an important primary producer as well. Just like plants, they can also convert the sun's energy through photosynthesis. In addition to these primary producers, we have other consumers, such as this is a muskrat, and we have crayfish. Don't forget those bullfrogs and snakes, such as this northern water snake. We can throw some birds in there, like northern harriers, and other mammal predators, such as mink. So when you start to connect all these together by who eats whom, we have the crayfish who's eating that green algae. That algae also gets eaten by the pond snail. The crayfish gets eaten by the green sunfish. The green sunfish gets eaten by the mink. The green sunfish also gets eaten by the water snake. Crayfish gets eaten by the bullfrogs. Pond snails get eaten by the bullfrogs, but cattails, one of the producers, they get eaten by the pond snails. Cattails are also a favorite food of the muskrats. Don't forget those arrowheads also are eaten by the crayfish. Moving up in the food chain a little bit, we have our big name predators, such as the northern harrier, which eats the snake, and the muskrat, and the mink, which eats just about everything on this food web. So now you see why we call it a food web. There are just lines all over the place showing who eats whom. You can imagine how if you changed just one of these components of this food web, it would affect other parts of the food web. Some of the species within a food web have a particularly large impact on other species, and these are called keystone species. One example of a keystone species in a wetland environment is the lowly muskrat. So before we look at how the muskrat is a keystone species, first it's important to understand what a keystone species is. Now here in St. Louis, we should know something about keystones. Take a look at our St. Louis Arch. Pretty neat structure. But if you go back and look at some videos or documentaries about when it was built, one of the neatest parts about it was when they added the final piece, also known as the keystone, shown here in red. So the keystone is not the biggest piece in the arch. It's not the most numerous piece in the arch. There's only one of them. But it is the most important piece in that arch. That keystone is what holds the entire arch together. So when you think of a keystone species, don't think of it as the most abundant species in an ecosystem. Don't think of it as the most dominant species in an ecosystem. It's neither of those. A keystone species is one that supports the existence of many other species. And the key word here is that word support. So think of our arch now as an ecosystem, and there's some critical keystone species that's supporting all of this structure. If you were to remove that keystone species, what would happen to the arch? Well, this is a no-brainer. That arch would crumble. If a keystone species is removed from an ecosystem, then many of the components of that ecosystem can collapse. Let's go back to our wetlands ecosystem and see how a muskrat, this lowly creature, could be a keystone species. If you were to remove a muskrat, what would happen? Well, before you start looking up there at the mink and the northern harrier, I want you to look lower in the food chain at those cattails. Cattails are an aggressive plant. Muskrats love to eat them, and the muskrats keep them under control. If there are no muskrats, then the cattails are going to start growing like crazy, and they are going to grow out of control. Eventually, they're going to start outcompeting the other plants that are in the area, such as this arrowhead plant. Now, this arrowhead might be the favorite food of one of the crayfish. So now we don't have that food for the crayfish anymore, and these crayfish start to decrease in their population. Well, without the crayfish around to eat the algae, now we might have too much algae, which could result in algal blooms, which would deplete the dissolved oxygen in the water. Unfortunately, the green sunfish needs the dissolved oxygen, so our green sunfish population starts to decrease. Now, Mr. Mink is looking around wondering where all his food went. Muskrats are gone, sunfish are getting scarce, so pretty soon there's no more mink or northern harriers, and eventually you're left with a much less diverse ecosystem with things just like pond snails and bullfrogs and some water snakes, and unfortunately, no fish for you. So you can see how removing a keystone species like the muskrat could result in these widespread effects throughout the entire food web. Now, this is a pretty extreme example. In reality, ecosystems are pretty robust. They can tolerate quite a bit of change, but they can only tolerate so much. So that's part of the reasoning behind trying to protect as many species as possible in supporting a healthy ecosystem. Now it's your turn. Turn to page 77 in your Nature Unbound textbook and answer these questions about how this other keystone species, prairie lizards, contribute to the restoration of glades here in Missouri. With food webs as complex as they are, it's pretty much impossible to group things into these nice linear lines where organism X eats organism Y and organism Y eats organism Z and so on and so forth. Instead, scientists like to group things into levels, which are represented here on this pyramid. The first level is the producers, and you've heard lots about these. I won't dwell on them. These are our plants like the cattails and the arrowheads, but don't forget about the algae as well. The second level is going to be our primary consumers. Actually, the next three levels are all different types of consumers. So the primary consumers, not surprisingly, eat the producers. Another term for this would be the herbivore, such as the muskrat or the snail. Next up on this list would be the secondary consumers. Secondary consumers eat primary consumers. So these would be carnivores, such as our frog and sunfish. Last but not least on our list would be the tertiary consumers. Tertiary consumers are the top level predators within an ecosystem. These are carnivores that eat other carnivores, and that means you're usually one of the bigger, faster organisms within that environment. Now, of course, because this is field biology, we've got to make it complicated, and we're going to give the layers of this pyramid overall, a fancy name. We're going to call these trophic levels. Now, that word trophic comes from a Greek word trophos, which means one who nourishes. So the trophic levels are showing who eats whom, much like a food chain or a food web, but in a simplified version. So I could say, oh, this is a secondary consumer, and you would know, that's a carnivore that eats herbivores. I might say this is a primary consumer, and you would know, oh, okay, this is something that eats plants. This is an herbivore. This is nice to look at it this way. It's, of course, never this simple. Some things, many things, in fact, are both secondary consumers and primary consumers. This would be an omnivore. something that eats meat but also eats plants. So organisms can fall into multiple categories here. One of the questions in the homework asked you, is it possible to have an organism which is both a producer and a secondary consumer? Perhaps you thought of those carnivorous plants, such as the Venus flytrap. So carnivorous plants undergo photosynthesis, but then they also capture and essentially digest other organisms, such as flies, to obtain nutrients from them. So yeah, sort of, it is like a secondary consumer and a producer at the same time. Why do we draw this like a pyramid with the producers on the bottom and these tertiary consumers at the top? Imagine you are that top level predator. You are the tertiary consumer. So here you are as the pink circle. Let's say you ate 8 fish to sustain you for 1 week. Now each of those fish also need to get their energy from something. They need to get their nourishment from somewhere. So let's suppose each of those fish has to eat 8 pond snails to sustain itself for 1 week. Those pond snails represent our primary consumers. But it doesn't end there. So let's say each of those pond snails has to consume 8 leaves from an arrowhead plant to sustain themselves for 1 week. So you can see how this starts to grow into a larger pyramid scheme, where you have the tertiary consumers on top, and they are supported by layers and layers of consumers and ultimately producers at the bottom. What's happening here is that energy is getting lost as you move from producers to primary consumers and so on up the ladder. So all of that sunlight that was used to produce food, well, most of that food went to the plants themselves so that they could grow. In fact, only a minuscule amount of that food, an estimated 1% of that energy, gets passed on to the next trophic level, the primary consumers. When the snails eat the plants, they get energy for themselves. But most of that energy they use. They use it for living, for surviving, for reproducing. Only a small portion actually gets passed on to whatever eats them. So, for instance, the fish eats the snail. Only about 5 to 20% of the energy from the snail gets passed on to the fish. And then you eat the fish. Only about 5 to 20% of the energy from the fish gets passed on to you. So every time you transition from one trophic level to another trophic level, you are losing a significant amount of energy. This is why in any given ecosystem, you're going to only have a few tertiary consumers, slightly more secondary consumers, a little bit more primary consumers, and lots of producers. Producers form the foundation of every ecosystem. So now you know a little bit more about the flow of energy through an ecosystem.